Thank you. Today, I'll be giving you an update, one that in a series that you've asked for on sea level rise and climate change and its impact on the agency mission. The focus of today's talk will be on our flood control mission, and I'll be introducing a program that we put in place about 4 years ago called the Flood Protection Level of Service. But before I get into that, there's some updates on the entire concept about the entire agency. The one project I'd like to make sure you're aware of is that the Lake Okeechobee Regulation Schedule laws is being updated. It's been updated to coincide with the completion of repair works on Herbert Hoover Dike. It's essentially the water control plan for Lake Okeechobee. And Lake Okeechobee is operated, as I mentioned earlier, to balance many objectives. It's a very important initiative for us. As we look at that effort that the Corps is starting on, and we're going to collaborate and work very tightly with them on it, we believe it's important to use this opportunity to bring into consideration any aspects of climate change or sea level rise that might affect the strategies we use in operating Lake Okeechobee. So I was just letting you know that as we engage with the Corps on laws update, we're talking with experts in the field to help us craft the message we need to take back to the Corps on things they need to consider about sea level rise and climate change when we look at laws operation. It could affect things as much as balancing the effects of saltwater intrusion to temperature within the lake. But it's a broad area. I just want to let you know that we were engaged on this. The next couple of items are focused on the future. The Committee on Independent Scientific Review for Everglades Restoration, CISREP, recently put forward their 7th biennial report. They reviewed SERP and everything that was going, and they had comments in 4 key areas. They saw progress in restoration, which was a good thing. They also identified some concerns they had in monitoring and assessment. They identified the laws, the regulation schedule work that I mentioned earlier. They also called for a mid-course assessment, but the focus they had was as we look towards the future, that we should consider climate change and sea level rise on what the Everglades should look like. I'd like to assure you that as we do projects right now, we do consider sea level rise and climate change, and nothing in some of the recommendations are completely inconsistent with what we're doing. The big event that happened here, actually in the county here, in the last month of October, was the 10th annual leadership summit of the Climate Compact. Your staff participated in that. It was a well-attended event. There was a lot of really good talks by local municipalities that are partners and that we work with. And we got a chance to see where they were looking. The theme for this year was looking back 10 years and then looking at the future. And it was good to engage in some of the discussions that we had. The last set of updates I'll share with you are 2 related but very exciting initiatives that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is kicking off that really meshes very closely with what we're doing. The first is the Southeast Coastal Assessment. It's a major study. It's part of a coastal management strategy that the Corps is looking to implement. I have a quote in there that I wouldn't read, but the focus is on getting more resilient coastal areas and coastlines. And what makes me particularly excited about this study is that it meshes very closely to the flood protection level of service studies and efforts that we're doing. Those efforts end at the coastal structure, and the Corps work extends from the coastline all the way to the coastal structures. And especially in parts of our footprint where those coastal structures are inland enough that there are communities downstream of them, this makes sure that the entire area is really looked at. We're talking to the Corps right now to make sure that the means and methods are not inconsistent, that the approach they use, they're familiar with what we're doing with FPLOS, and I think this is going to be an exciting opportunity going forward. Somewhat related is a series of back bay coastal storm risk management studies that the Corps is also taking on, and one of those is in Miami. The county has asked for our engagement, and we are engaged. We've participated in a couple of scoping or pre-scoping meetings, and I intend to be here tomorrow for charrette to look at alternatives to work with the Corps on. But that's my segue into the flood protection level of service program. And this is a critical part of our agency's strategy for assessing the impacts of sea level rise on our flood control mission. To bring everybody up to the same page, the flood control system in South Florida is multi-tiered. There are 3 tiers to it. The district and the Corps are responsible for the primary canal system and structures. That's the backbone of the flood control infrastructure. Local government, special drainage districts are responsible for the secondary canal systems and structures, and landowners and homeowner associations for the tertiary. For the system to work well and to continue to work well into the future, those three systems must mesh and work well together. So the program that we're going to put in place must, one, focus on the primary, but also consider the needs of the secondary and tertiary. So what is the issue that we're facing? Well, along our coastline, we have several coastal structures, and the data we have shows that sea levels rising at most of the gauges that we're looking at. The challenge is we have coastal structures that are gravity structure. If sea levels rising, the tailwater is also going to rise. And understanding that I'm going to go through some jargons, if you don't mind, I'll take maybe a minute or so to try to get some of the language square with everybody. So when I say tailwater, I really mean the downstream end. Think Atlantic Ocean if you're in this area. When I say headwater, I mean the inland water level within the canal, the part that's upstream of the structure. Most of the structures I said are gravity structures, and they're open to let water move from the higher level in the headwater to the lower level in the tailwater. And so typically what happens is we have this control rules that says when water level gets to a particular elevation, you open the structure to let water through. So the water passes through, and the tailwater rises, but eventually the water level subsides again, and the water in the headwater side starts to drop. Good. And when that happens, it gets to a particular level, and you close the structure again. That's really at the bottom line how our gravity structures operate. The challenge is, as you have rising sea levels and you have high tide during those sea level events, you could get water levels that are higher on the tailwater side than the headwater side. When that happens, you can't open the structure because opening it will let saltwater in with the potential to contaminate groundwater aquifers that we rely on for water supply within the region. So that is the challenge as it affects our flood control mission. The more those gates are closed, we're unable to provide storm relief because we can't open them. And that's what we're trying to address. And many years ago, about 8-9 years ago, we did an initial assessment, screening assessment based on the design criteria for our coastal structures. And what we found was that most of the coastal structures in Miami-Dade County and Broward are the most at-risk structures for rising sea levels. There are also a number on the West Coast in Big Cypress Basin. It wasn't particularly surprising, and it was something we're able to come up with. The question was what we're going to do about it. And so the flood protection level of service program was what we thought would be the strategy to put in place. Its role, or its job, was to help us identify and prioritize the long-term infrastructure needs of the agency, to assess flood protection throughout the full 16-county region over time, identify the at-risk structure, what are the structures that are most at risk, where in our system we have bottlenecks that need to be addressed if we are to continue to provide the level of service that people are used to. Provide a formal way to initiate a number of key decisions, adaptations to help deal with rising sea level. And it involves a heavy amount of coordination. I'm going to mention this at least one more time during this talk with local government, the other people who have flood protection or water management type responsibilities, drainage districts and the sort. Our initial effort through the agency to prioritize identified a number of locations along the Miami-Dade, Broward region, also on the West Coast, has the highest priorities to address first. And so based on those locations being identified, we pushed forward with a pilot study in the C4 basin in Miami-Dade County. The reason why we did a pilot was this wasn't something we'd done for many years, and we needed to learn how to do this level of service work well. The focus was on using staff to do the work, learning what we needed to do so that we could write good scopes to outsource the work when we try to cover the rest of the agency. It's a fair amount of work that needs to be done. What typically happens during an LOS study, our focus is on the primary system, as I mentioned. We create a volume of a series of reports that are highly advantageous to us and to others who work with us that describe the watershed that we're working on, the structures that within it, and provides a number of other interesting details. We look at how that system is working today. We look at how it continues to work with different levels of sea level rise, and we do that with different storms of different intensities. And when it's all done, we identify the underperforming parts or segments of our flood control system, and we coordinate heavily with the counties that we're working with. What do we measure? When we do the assessment, to start this work, we talked to many people about what does level of service mean to you? What do we measure? Well, we found out that it meant many things to many people. Within the canal system, we want to know if the water stays within bank. We also want to know if the canal has enough capacity to carry the flows, and if it continues to do so with rising sea level, higher tailwater. On the land side, we want to know if there is flooding, how deep is it, and how long does it stay flooded. And on the structure side, we want to make sure that the structure continues to have adequate capacity to pass the flows that need to be passed through it. Recent completions, I mentioned the C4. That was a pilot project. We learned everything we needed to learn from that, and we're able to initiate 2 scopes with consulting firms to do work on 2 key initiatives, C7 and Big Cypress Basin. We recently completed both of those efforts. The C7 were tying up nicely. Because of the funding for that project, one of the requirements was that we come up with a methodology for evaluating projects, which gets added to the county's mitigation strategy, and that's moving forward nicely. On the Big Cypress Basin end, and Mr. Baba has seen enough of these presentations from me, we identified the immediate initiatives or projects that the Big Cypress Basin needed to work on, and included those in this capital program, and also identified a longer-term project that would need to be discussed with the county to see how something like that would need to move forward. There are a number of other efforts that are ongoing, and I just skipped over this slide very quickly, but they include looking at surge, better representation of the surge modeling in the area around Biscayne Bay, coming up with standardized climate scenarios that we can use for all our work across the 16-county region, and hopefully will be available to consultants, other local government that work within the region, so we don't have disparaging or different standards set by different people as they approach this topic. But there are a number of efforts going on that we're excited about, and there are a number of new stats that I'll mention in a minute. But something that's related that I mentioned earlier is the Canal Conveyance initiative that we're also doing. And I kind of bring this up because it kind of ties in nicely with the level of service work. Level of service looks at future condition. Canal Conveyance looks at the current condition. And within this region, one of the stats we have this fiscal year is the look at the C100 system. That's something that my team is going to be working on this year. There'll be surveys of the canals. We'll look at its hydraulic capacity. It's work that should be of interest to folks in South Dade. So, thank you. You funded us nicely for the level of the flood protection level of service effort. $600,000 for the current year for the stats that we plan on making, and $3 million over the next 5 years. The stats for this year, the projects we're hoping to move forward are C8 and C9 watersheds. It's the upper portion of Miami-Dade County and the lowermost portion of Broward County. We intend to also move forward revision of the impact or the assessment of all of the coastal structures using some of the new metrics we've learned since we did the pilot, the C4 pilot, and we did the initial screening about 10 years ago. We're also, as I mentioned, initiating the effort on the conveyance assessment for the C100 system. When we do finish the assessment in each basin, typically what needs to happen is if we find a deficiency, we initiate more detailed study that will identify solutions that we'll then have to bring back to you for funding. These are not going to be trivial. Some of these are going to be very expensive, and we believe that informing you frequently and completely will prevent sticker shock when that time comes. But they also tee off a number of important legal and policy issues that we would like to bring back to you. Most of the CNSF system was built by U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We maintain them. As they come due for maintenance and refurbishment, with the level of service work, we may identify that they need to be modified or replaced. And there are some important questions about whose responsibility is it. Some of them are legal, some of them are policy. I'm sure you'll be weighing into some of these as we bring the issues up to you. So that's the initial part of the flood protection piece that I wanted to share with you today. Introduces the level of service program, but there are a few more things on the flood control mission element that I would be bringing back. I've told you how we do it. I'd like to share with you at some point later on the ones that we've looked at and what we found, and what we're doing about it. I also want to make sure you understand that there's some serious uncertainty on all issues related to climate change and sea level rise, and we'll be asking you to make some decisions with deep uncertainty. The good thing is there are many techniques that are being used in the field, and we're working very hard on a couple of projects to help crystallize those techniques and see if we can bring something to you to help you with those decision making. Those will be subjects of future studies or future presentations in the series. And of course, I'll also bring back talks in the series on water supply and the natural systems.